This one came out, and as your local tech obsessive, all I can think is why don't we strike Java out of that image and make that JavaScript? To be honest with you, it came out of the IT Humor and Memes Uncensored Facebook group and everything, and, you know, uh, I don't really have an opinion all that much about Java itself, only it the Temple OS crowd shows up, Jesus. Look, all I have to say about Temple OS at this point is the world's moved on, dude. Even the Linux crowd has moved on. Seriously, there are some paradigms that he wasn't aware of and everything that he just kind of yeah. I mean, I'm a tinkerer, but I don't know. I'm not interested in that one in particular. But no, Java itself doesn't deserve this kind of critique because Java is nowhere near as bad as JavaScript is. Like, ugh. I just can't with this and Jesus, the Holy See. I have no idea what he did with Holy See, to be honest with you. What the derivative differences are. I'm actually mildly curious at this point. But anyways, Java doesn't deserve this kind of criticism. JavaScript does. Anyways, I wanted to launch into this and everything, and this is a very opinionated and anti JavaScript video that's coming and everything. Like, hey devs, this is going to be and web devs, this is going to be a lesson for you that's right up in your face. All right, it's educational in a way and everything. The utopian dream of JavaScript goes something like this, right? Every operating system, every platform, in fact, even video game consoles these days has at least the fundamentals of a web browser in it. So basically, in this modern era for most modern devices, if you were to hypothetically write it in JavaScript, then it would run on anything. I can run the same program that can run in Firefox, can run on Linux, it can run on any operating system all at once, right? And that was supposed to be, something that was ultimately supposed to have, it was supposed to, at the end of the day, it would save programmers time, effort, labor, and everything. And I gotta say, I may not be really so much of a coder as I am a prompt engineer who's like I'm my father's legacy of writing code lives on within me to such an extent that I'm obsessed with programming. Certain at a certain level, I usually don't like to go really deep and everything, and so I'm willing to let the AI do most of the heavy lifting for me in that department. But I know more than the average, I guess you could say somebody that's vibe coding. I know more than that. I'm not that amateurist at it. I'm not that. I look at the code that it's doing. I learn things all the time from looking at it and such. So it's not like I'm existing in a paradigm where just because I'm generating code, I'm not learning anything from reading the code. That's not how any of this works. Anyways, but my whole beef with this is that like I said, the utopian dream of it is that everything has a web browser in it these days, and so you can write it once and it will run on anything. But how has that worked out in practice? Really, truly. Now, not every a lot of web devs are going to say, well, it's worked out beautifully and everything, but no, I mean, think about it. you know this is a paradigm where, for instance, every couple of months there's somebody that comes out with a new JavaScript framework. It happens all the time, and then people have to refactor their code for the new framework all the time. It happens so frequently. They're optimizing for it, so they have to write it again and everything. But then there's just the reality that all these programs and JavaScript apps that are clogging up the web at this point, because there's just such a massive amount of them that are all depending on package, uh, you know, some. npm, pulls in like over 200 packages that come in with it and everything, just to do the most simple of things and everything that have to come in with it. It has to be this massive, bloated, unwieldy database of shit that's coming in at the same time, just to make all this stuff run and everything on it. And and that's Node right there for npm. But like the whole problem with all this is that there's so many moving parts in it, and all those little like libraries in JavaScript and everything, and small scale like dependencies. There's usually an active maintainer who's working on maintaining that dependency and everything. And what happens when that person decides to update their code and everything, and it breaks everything on the other end? Or what happens if a developer decides, hey, I don't want to do this anymore or maintain my project, and edits their code in a way like the left pad incident, and everything, and just deletes it and just decides to take their ball and go on with their lives and everything, and just leaves the tech space, and it breaks a bunch of websites as a result. I mean, I've lived through watching half the internet down because of the left pad incident and everything. My shit was up and everything. I wasn't running a server though, so but I could still access the web on certain websites, but half the web was down at the time and everything because of the left pad incident. And when I look at this and I see what's going on and everything, this image, I'm just like, why are you picking on Java? Like, what the hell? Like, I don't have a lot to say about it because I'm not like extensively knowledgeable about Java. I don't. So like, if I said anything negative about Java, it would come from a place of just like extreme ignorance. I know about JavaScript and its warts. I don't know about Java. I don't. So I don't have anything to say about Java. And that's it. They it's JavaScript that was supposed to run on all operating systems because there's a browser that runs on all operating systems, and once you can offload it to the browser, you supposedly can get away with running it once, but that's not how it actually works out in practice for web devs. Web devs find themselves in this terrible situation where it's like, you end up in this bottle where it's like, you write your code once, and then the person who's maintaining one of the dependencies that it is resting on updates their package in a way that isn't backwards compatible, and then all of a sudden you've got to refactor all the portions of your code that call on that one portion of code. It's like an interdependence hell that these people exist inside, and like that interdependence hell is a product of the language now having so many moving parts at this point that those moving parts are constantly being refined and updated and everything, and every time something does get updated in one of those dependencies, it risks breaking everything that comes along, depending on it. And there may be thousands and thousands of websites that are all relying on that one piece of code, like it was with LeftPad. It had woken itself up in that, and these are bad web development paradigms that have kind of like stepped in like a sickness on the internet because of this whole copy and paste, into Notepad without really understanding and everything. You might understand the most rudimentary elements of the code, but you're just at that point, you're just gluing pieces and snippets of code together to get things to do things instead of really coding, and that's just not, and that is a fundamental sickness that has happened in the way that the internet has learned to code, this gluing pieces together shit that it, has learned how to do. And, but anyways, what I was getting at is that it's got so many interdependent qualities that all lean on each other that, all it takes is one package maintainer updating their package in a way that isn't backwards compatible, and then a bunch of developers have a headache on their hands where they have to update their code and refactor it to do things the new way, the Python 3 way instead of the Python 2 way, and everything. And that's a lot. And by that point, there's so much code, that it becomes a massive headache for a huge amount of developers that are all facing the same problem at the same time, and it's distributed all over. Every web dev is all now worried about the same fucking problem, and it's just so widely distributed it exists at pretty much every company at all. The department that actually maintains the website is now, whether or not they have an IT department that does other things in the website, but the ones that are in their web department are now beset with a massive headache that's going to people are going to be called in to work from home and everything and brought in, and it's just going to be a stressful day for them all around as a result of this. And JavaScript was supposed to be write once, run anywhere, but how, like I said, with so many interdependent parts, things are breaking all the time. And eventually enough shit breaks that your website just becomes completely just unfunctional and everything, because JavaScript can only take so many errors before it can't do, what, it's supposed to do anymore. The browser console can take some, and the browser can take some abuse and still run your code with JavaScript, but it can't take so much of it that it just gets so completely overwhelming. Otherwise, your website will crash. Once it gets too many of them, it will ultimately go down, and stop being able to be run by people. And so what does that, what does that lead to ultimately? And it can also lead to undefined and unexpected behavior. If one of those websites updates the way that it happens, maybe your code does run, but it doesn't run in the way that you wanted it to or intended it to, which also is very alarming because it could ultimately end up working in a way that makes your website exploitable as a result of trying to graft itself onto a situation that the code wasn't prepared for. And this nightmare of an issue is one in which you're not ready. It didn't work out in practice. Now you're in a much more unstable situation where you end up having to adapt your code 1,000 different times every time somebody updates one of the dependencies that it's resting on. And then think about it even bigger picture. What was it like in the days before this utopian dreams about JavaScript went in, and developers were so frustrated about having to deal with it and everything in languages like C. But in reality, back then, I guess you could say that there were only like 3 major operating systems at that point. There's the Nix operating systems and, Nix and BSD, sorry. And I know there are people that are very particular about separating that, but, to me, BSD is POSIX compliant, so it's basically star.nix. It's just another way of being Nix. So don't get at me with that stuff. I yeah. Anyways, so I just think of BSD as like a better version of Linux, where it's basically just better package management and everything, a better selection of packages, and that it's being maintained by people that are a little bit more experienced and everything, and so they know what works and what doesn't and everything, and that they've put together a very compelling package, and and everything. They're more professional, so it's like Linux but more professional. That's kind of how I think of BSD, but no, I mean, if it would run on Linux, it would reasonably run on BSD. So, I mean, blow me about that critique. But anyways, so I mean, if it ran on Linux but not BSD, then your critique would hold merit towards this discussion. But the problem was that in that world, initially, I guess OS 2 existed, so there were like 3 platforms. There was Windows, there was the Nix, the star.nix world, and there was OS 2 and everything. But OS 2 died, and now, a language like C, you only really end up having to write it for Windows and Linux and everything. You can port it from Linux to Windows. That means you write your code twice, and then once you're done writing it, you're done. You don't have to actively maintain anything anymore. And if it's open source, you can hope somebody else picks up the project and maintains it for you. You know, if they find it useful enough, they will. But no, JavaScript hasn't worked out in practice for that utopian dream. Like I said, I mean, I was going over. You know, everything is now such a fucking massive world of interdependencies and those moving parts and everything, and they move a lot faster than any of the dependencies and libraries in C do. And on top of that, you know, the benefit with C libraries is that you can maintain a local copy of it so that it doesn't matter. You know, if the library changes, if it updates to a new version and you're still, you know, you still have the old H file that start.h files, then it don't matter that it's updated and changed the way that it does things. You know, your software still runs on people's systems, and you know this is like I said, this is what like drives a lot of my frustration with all of it. You know, because it's like developers are still using it like crazy. You know, they're not really adopting the WebAssembly. They're not doing any of this because they're so convinced. You know, I'm only going to have to run it once. Well, that doesn't actually work in practice. With all the moving parts, you end up having to refactor your code even more times than you did, you know, in the times in which you had to port from one operating system to another. In reality, at this point, it's write twice and then it will run on anything.